Good afternoon, class. Welcome to this session of International Business Organization. In our last class, we were discussing regarding recent trends in globalization. And some of the points we had already discussed that were, the global banking structure. That is to tell how banking system has changed after the globalization. And we also studied the increasing economic power of emerging markets and increasing privatization. Now, the next point is in terms technological revolution. Now it goes without telling that with the advent of both the information on one hand and communication on the other hand, new business opportunities are more than ever before nowadays. Now, the new phones and even the broadband connections are changing the way of doing business by promoting virtual teams. And moreover, the role of government in enhancing the use of technology is quite commendable. That is to tell, the concept of smart city under the flagship of present National Democratic Alliance, government clearly reflects the importance that is being placed on the technological revolution that the government attempts to introduce in our country. Now for this the government is also considering international financials financial flows also. Now, all these things can happen only because of globalization. Now, when we speak about globalization, we should always remember that globalization is not only in terms of trading goods or services. Globalization can also help in getting help from other country in form of capital inflow and all other things, wherein one economy would be integrated with another economy. The next one under the recent trends is uh, changing demographic features. Now, owing to this globalization, the one more thing which was already changing in nature is changing in a rapid phase is the consumer taste and preferences. And it is changing at a very, very rapid pace. Now, more and more women candidates are getting employment in industry and financial house. And on the one hand, and on the other, growing e-commerce platforms are helping all the consumers and the prospective customers in buying and not buying, even selling through international platforms. Now, these international platforms are create new, avenues and opportunities for people. To give an example, the Japanese economy is witnessing what we call as aging population. However, it is finding respite in selling its products to the worldwide consumers. Now, one more recent trend is international arbitration. Now, arbitration in very, very simple terms to tell is nothing but we buy something from a place where it is available for less cost and we are going to sell it somewhere we can get a higher price for our goods. Now, this can happen not only in goods but also it has in share markets also or any other such thing. Now, these days, international arbitration are playing an important role in directing how global business strategies would move. Now, these disputes, which are being termed as which are outside the purview of domestic rules and regulations, are referred to international arbitrators. Now, the existence of these agencies is not only resolving the said disputes but also promoting and enhancing confidence among the business fraternities for entering into international trade relationships. Now, one more trend that we can see is competitive advantage. Now, with the globalization, most of the emerging markets are witnessing slower growth rates. That is to tell, they have all reached all that they can reach and have come to a point of saturation. So, this situation is placing, that is to tell, the globalization is playing an important role that the emerging markets can play in driving international growth rates. Now, in trade relations, emerging markets, they vividly highlight the growth importance and competitive advantage for those economies which goes in for globalization. Now, with globalization, one more thing that is happening is regional and economic blocks. Now, when we tell it is ULOCL, now these blocks are a grouping of associations, countries, or people. Now, people might be who are concerned with same kind of business or who belong to some same territory, they come together and they try to business in a way how it would benefit uh, every other individual who is there in the grouping. Now, individual might also mean a country here under the regional economic bloc. Now, these regional and economic blocs might be like EU or what we call as European Union or Asian and other such, or maybe NAFTA, SAPSA. Now, they are slowly increasing cooperation among the international economy. Now, these economies are opening up their, respective domestic economies for international investors also. And as a result of all this, these regional and economic blocs are having an impact on the global business environment altogether. Now, this is all about what we had to discuss under the international business or global business. Might be the privatization, liberalization, and globalization. Now, these things might not have been mentioned in particular in your syllabus, but understanding all this becomes important for you to know how global business is going, how it was earlier, and what are the changes that has taken place, and because of these changes, how business is happening in the recent days. Now, we studied regarding globalization. Now, globalization is such a thing wherein we tell by, having some of the reforms like might be privatization, wherein we give opportunity for the private people from within the country, outside the country, to invest in the business other than the government investing in it. Or by the way of liberalization. Now, under liberalization, what happens is that we lessen the number of rules and regulation. Those rules and regulation which would help in doing business in other countries easily, or when it comes to our economy, we are lessening the rules and regulation so that people from other countries would be willing to invest in our country and do business. Now that is liberalization. Now to globalization to happen, this liberalization and privatization becomes two important factors. And globalization together, we call it as a situation wherein which the entire globe is regarded as one market. There would be as minimum or as less rules and regulations as possible, and also along with that there would be easy movement of capital, easy movement of labor, and also easy movement of financial flows. Now, this is all about globalization. But as we studied earlier, now there are some of the arguments which goes against what we call as globalization. And one such argument is that whenever a country goes in for globalization, definitely it brings many of the advantages for the country which goes in for globalization. But along with that, there would be some of the demerits or disadvantages which the economies or the countries will have faced. That is to tell, there might be chance because of globalization, the disadvantages might be more than what advantages the globalization is going to bring in. Now it might result in a in a very bad way for the local or local companies or small companies which might not be having enough capital to fight against the global competition. Now, it is very easy to understand why this happens, because whenever we speak of globalization or whenever we tell that we are going to enter into a different market, now it is quite understandable that only those companies which have a strong hold in the domestic country, or those companies which has huge amount at its hand for the disposal of new venture, only such companies can go in for globalization. I mean, go in for doing business in other countries. Now, along with that, they will also have for themselves what we call as economies of scale. That is to tell, compared to other small business, would definitely be in a position wherein they can, produce goods or provide services in a cheaper rate compared to the small business. So whenever a country goes in for globalization, whenever other people come from other countries and start business, might be that at small and cottage industry in particular, and this is what has happened in our country also. So now, when the economists, after going for globalization, realized that there are some aspects which would hinder, the economy's other sectors. They went on with what we call as protectionism. The protectionism was also there earlier, but the way in which it used to be has changed in the recent days. Now, speaking about this protectionism, it is a policy of protecting especially the domestic industry against the foreign competition. Now, the main aim is that we protect our industries, and we protect it through by means of, it could be tariffs, it could be subsidies, import quotas, or other restrictions, or even sometimes what we call as handicaps placed on the imports of foreign competitors. Now, speaking regarding tariffs, tariffs is nothing but a tax at any importer in the country will have to pay on the goods that he would be importing. Now, what happens here in the case that if at all country finds it that the goods that are being imported are adversely affecting the interests of the country, they would fix the tariffs to such level wherein which the price of the goods might increase, and there would be a reduction in demand for such imported goods. Now, all this I've been explaining in a very general. Now, moving forward, subsidies refers to some of the encouragement that are being given by the government to do business in the country itself or to start exporting things. Now, import quotas. Now, quotas refers to a thing wherein there would be restriction for the quantity, the numbers, or the kgs, or whatever we can tell. It would be not in terms of money, but a restriction in terms of quantity. So, those refers to quotas. Now, these protectionist policies have been implemented by many countries despite the fact that virtually all mainstream economists agree that world economy generally benefits from free trade. Now, this is what the actual situation is. Now, when people are in WTO, when they are members of this organization, and to stay stand, definitely each and every economy, they agree that, the world economy is more better when it is free trade among countries. But then indirectly, they would be using the measures such as tariffs and quotas by a way in which they can, restrict the competition from this globalization. So that is what actually happened. They are telling a thing, but then they are also restricting the freedom on the other hand. Now, this protectionism is the economy of, economic policy of restricting import from other countries, as we said, through methods such as tariffs on imported goods, import quotas, and a variety of other government regulations. Now, those who agree with protectionism policy idea, they argue that the protectionist policy will always shield the produce, the business, and the workers of the of the import competing sector in the country from the foreign competitors. Now, however, they also, on the other hand, reduce trade and affect adversely for the consumers in general. That is to tell, now uh, under protectionism policy we have tariffs, and in globalization we speak of free trade. Now the protectionism is globalization. It tells we have to protect our regional industry. So we have the measures such as tariffs, and when we put tariff, the rate of the goods goes up, and we will be left with the choice of having goods only the domestic land. But then when we think the consumer point of view, if there was no tariffs, if there was protectionism policy, me, I as a consumer would be benefited more globalization because I would have been purchased goods for a lesser cost than what I will have paid now. And this protectionism is also said that it harms the producers and workers, those who are in sports sector. Now, the exporters, both the country implementing protectionist policy and in the countries protected against. That it tells, because exporters, those who are there out of the country, they would be affected because until the transport might be the goods switch, but thereafter it was something called as tariff, and tariffs added to the price of the goods when more than what is available at their domestic country, definitely that comes down. Now the exporters, the economies who goes in protectionism policy, they will be affected because now this protectionism policy is a tariffs is a two-way policy. Now I as a country, if I impose tariffs, definitely the country which is exporting to my country would implement tariffs from its side also. Now, these government levied tariffs are the chief protectionist measure. Now, they raise the price of the imported articles, making them more expensive, and they're making them less attractive than domestic products. Now, the protective tariffs have historically, been employed to stimulate industries in countries have been affected by recession or depression. Now, this protectionism policy may be helpful for the emerging industries, or it might be helpful in the developed nations. Now, it can also serve as a means of forcing what we call as self-sufficiency, especially in the defense industries. Now, import quotas also offer another case of protectionism. Now, these quotas set an absolute limit or a limit on the amount of certain goods that can be imported into a country, and tend to be more effective than protective tariffs. Now, which these tariffs or which do not always, dissuade consumers who are willing to pay a higher price for an imported goods. Now, this is one more point that we'll have to keep in mind. Yes, I, as a country, to protect my industry, I might go in for protectionism policy. I might, what we call as tariff. But then, what we should remember is that there would be a whole section of consumers for whom the price doesn't matter. Okay, for them, what matters is their preference and ability to buy these goods. In such cases, than the tariffs, the import quotas will always hit the economy. Because under import quotas, it is not regarding tax, but the restriction would be on the quantity. Now, speaking regarding, the protectionism, throughout history, wars and also economic difference or what we call as a recession in the economy have led to increase the protectionism. On the other hand, the peace and prosperity, whenever economies faces, tended to encourage free trade. Now, if we see the histories, the European monarchies favored protectionism policy in the 17th, 18th centuries. And they, favored the protectionism policy, especially an attempt to increase trade and build their domestic economies, and they wanted this to happen at the expense of other nations. Now, these policies, now discredited, became known as mercantilism. Now, the Great Britain had begun to abandon its protective tariffs in the first half of the 19th century after it had achieved preeminence in Europe. Now, the Britain, its trunking of protectionism in favor of free trade was symbolized by its repeal in 1846 of the Corn Laws and other duties on the imported grain. Now, all these things are certain words which has happened in the history. Knowing it is very, very important, but then it cannot be explained in detail in the class. So I give you the work of today, how this protectionism policy was in history, or for that matter, what are this mercantilism, or what are these corn laws, and how the trade happened during 17th and 18th century. Now, protectionist policy in Europe are relatively, mild in the second half of the 19th century. Although France, Germany, and several other countries are compelled at the times to impose custom duties as a means of sheltering their growing industrial sectors from the British competition. But however, by 1913, custom duties were looked through the Western world and import quotas were hardly used. Now, it was the damage and dislocation caused by World War I that inspired a continual raising of custom barriers in Europe in the 1920s. And also during the Great Depression of the 30s, recorded levels of unemployment encouraged, epidemic of protection measures, and due to all this, world trade shrank drastically during the 30s or during the times of World War and the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the United States had long history as a protectionist country with its tariffs reached their high point in the 1820s and during the Great Depression also. Now, during the 1930s, in the United States, the average tariff on imported goods was raised by roughly 20%. Now, the country's protectionist policies changed towards the middle of 20th century, and in the year 1947, the United States was one of the 23 nations signed the trade agreement in the form of what we call GATT or General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now, this agreement was amended, or in other words, some changes were brought to this in 1994 and was replaced in 1995 by what we call as WTO or World Trade Organization in Geneva. Now, through WTO negotiation, most of the world's major trading nations have substantially reduced their custom tariffs. Now, the reciprocal trade agreements, they typically limit protectionist measures instead of eliminating entirely. However, it calls for protectionism still heard when industry in various countries suffer economic hardship or job losses believed to be increased foreign competition. Now, there is always a conscious among economists that protectionism has a negative effect on the economic growth and also on the economic welfare, while free trade, deregulations, and the reduction of trade barriers has a significant positive effect on economic growth. Now, some scholars have also implicated protectionism as the cause of some economic crisis, most notably the Great Depression. However, trade liberalization can sometimes result in large and unequally distributed losses and gains and can, in the short run cause significant economic dislocation of workers in import competing sector, and free trade has advantage of lowering costs of goods and services for both producers and consumers. Okay. Now that was the entire idea reading. What do we mean by protectionism policy or the history behind having protectionism policy for a country? Now, what was the necessary or what is the necessary and how does it affect or what is it in reality? Now, moving forward regarding this protectionist policy, a variety of policies have been used to achieve protectionist goals. Now, as we discussed earlier, these include tariffs and import quotas, which are the most common type of protectionist policies. One thing to a tariff, nothing but an excise tax levied on imported goods, originally imposed to raise government revenue. And modern tariffs are now more often designed to protect domestic produce that compete with foreign importers. Now, an import is a limit on the volume of the goods that need to be legally imported, usually established through an import licensing regime. And protection of, it can happen in terms of technologies, patents, technical know-how, and also scientific knowledge. And this can happen in foreign direct investment also. That is restrictions on FDI, it says, restrictions acquisition of domestic firms by the foreign companies. And some of the things are some of policies that are taken under this protectionism policy are, the first one is administrative barriers. Now the countries sometimes, they are accused of using their various administrative rules. Might be for the first they tell, yes, we are all about globalization, we are all about free trade. But when people try to export goods, they might rest in terms of, regarding might be food safety, environmental standards, electric safety, and these create a way to introduce barriers to imports. That is to tell, might be I tell, yes, you can, export goods in my country. You are welcome here to do business. But then by using such restriction, I tell the goods what you have produced are not the standard of what we expect. Therefore, we as a country cannot accept your goods. Now, in a very indirect way, they are going to take the protectionist policy. The next one is anti-dumping legislation. Now, before speaking about anti-dumping, we should know what is dumping. Now, dumping is the practice of firms selling to export markets at lower price than they are charged in the domestic markets. Now, speak about dumping. Now, consider yourself as, the leader of maybe a manufacturer early in the 1950s in US. Now, what happened during that time is that the television as a technology was very famous and everybody started using it. The US reached a point wherein there was no any kind of more growth in that part of the market. So what this manufacturer did was they started exporting goods to other countries where the market for the television had just started. Now, in dumping, what happens is that then the company or the country which takes this policy, they are of the thinking that instead of not having any kind of revenue, it is better for us to have less revenue. So, in this growing market of television, they reduced their prices and started selling. So, definitely as a result of that, people start buying those goods which were imported. Now, the supporters, those who support anti-dumping laws, they argue that they prevent the import of cheap foreign goods that would cause local firms to close. However, in practice, anti-dumping laws are usually used to impose trade tariffs to foreign exporters. Now, speaking regarding this globalization and protectionism policy, you will have to know what are this policy, what what does it speaks of. But then you should also understand the reality of all these things. The next one is direct subsidies. Now the government subsidies, it will be in the form of lump sum payments, or it can also be happen in terms of cheap loans, are sometimes given to local firms. Now that cannot compete against the imports. Now these subsidies have the opposite effect of export tariffs because exporters get payment which is a percentage or proportion of the value of exported. Now, export subsidies increase the amount of trade, and in a country with floating exchange rates have effect similar to what we call as import subsidies. The next one is exchange rate control. Sorry, I guess we missed the fact that we were discussing regarding direct subsidies. Now, under direct subsidies, as we discussed earlier, it would be in the form of lump sum payments or cheap loans, and are sometimes given to local firms that cannot compete against the importers. Now, these subsidies are, for the reason to protect local jobs and to help local firms adjust the world market. But the export subsidies are often used by government to increase the exports. Now, export subsidies have the opposite effect of export tariffs. Now, export tariffs are nothing but when I export goods, I supposed to pay tax to the government. Now, because when export tariffs is there and the exporters has to pay, and with the economy going in for export subsidies, in actual sense the exporters get the payment which would be a percentage or proportion of value of the goods that are going to be exported. Now these export subsidies increase the amount of trade, and in a country which has the exchange rate of floating exchange rate will have the effect similar to that of import subsidies. Now there are still two more under this protectionism policy which we shall discuss in our next session. I have taken down your attendance and you can leave the meeting for the day. Thank you, class.